Welcome to the After Socrates Companion. This is part 3. This video is part of a playlist that's intended to be viewed sequentially. So if you haven't seen the other videos, please go to Mindful Before Meaning, the YouTube page, the channel page. Click over to playlist and find the After Socrates Companion playlist and start at the beginning. As always, we start off with the simultaneous sigh. The thing that makes everything better. Every single thing. And you know why. You know. All you need is this wonderful air that surrounds this good earth and a little bit of goodwill, good faith, learned optimism, positivity, bravery, courage. Any virtue will do. Any virtue. Take your pick. And you need to take a deep breath and sigh in synchrony with me. Here we go. 1, 2, 3. Oh, that did it. I did not sleep well last night. Was a little bit tired up until this point. Melted away. I feel alert. I feel energized. I feel ready to meditate. So we're going to start by getting into our comfortable, upright and dignified meditation posture. I'm going to start by, let me see if I want to kneel today. I recommend sitting or sitting up on something. Sitting flat on the floor doesn't quite allow your back to, no, that's not right. Doesn't allow your back to be as relaxed as it needs to be. So find your comfortable, there we go, meditation posture. Sit up on something to elevate yourself so you can have a nice straight spine and proper posture for your back. If you are on a chair, your feet should be flat on the floor. And then we'll start by rocking forward and back to find our center. Go past center forward, past center back. Feel your way to your center by going a little past it in each direction and then settling into that center point where you feel it to be. Now you can do left and right. Feel your way past the center. A little bit each time, less and less, until you find that center point. You can do your head, open up the chest. Relax your shoulders. I like to let my arms drop down. So I use gravity to help me make sure they're relaxed and my hands can just fall and rest where they fall. On the first day, we pictured ourselves using John Vervaeke's imaginative practice. We pictured ourselves as the prisoners locked in Plato's cave. Yesterday, part 2, we pictured ourselves as the escapee, seeing the world for the first time in true light, in sunlight, and also as the prisoners who remained, having this prisoner return to try to persuade them to take the journey out into the outside world. But for now, just want to relax our belly. Breathe into that. Relax our face. Choose if we want our eyes open or closed. Adjusting our stimuli, our sensory load. To help keep us now, our mind becoming centered. It's important in our mindfulness practice for us not to judge when thoughts emerge, but to simply observe. You can label the thought with a single word, thinking, if that works for you. And return to the breath, or whatever sensation it is that we're using in that moment to keep us grounded in the present moment. For me, I feel dryness in my throat. That sensation's a bit uncomfortable, and it's becoming a distraction for me, which is okay. I first want to become aware of it. Fully observe the sensation. And the landscape in my mind. I can choose to accept it and carry on my meditation. Or take a quick drink. Come back to my meditation posture. If I need to rock myself back into my center again, I'll do so. Return to awareness of the breath. Be deliberate about relaxing my belly, breathing deep down into my lower abdomen. Take a big yawn. Okay. If you want to continue to meditate longer on your own, please pause the video here. Hopefully you've had some time now to get into the John Vervaeke series, episode 1, After Socrates. I've listened to it a few times, and again yesterday. Yesterday I finally was very attentive and took some notes. He mentioned Rafe Kelly, which was particularly interesting to me. The combination of movement, play, and mindfulness. I look forward to looking more into the work that Rafe Kelly is doing. He essentially starts the lecture with a fairly long, in-depth description of animal tracking. And in the Scouts, I believe there's animal tracking. There's a tracking. I'm not sure if they call it tracking. Perhaps there's another word for it. There was or is a tracking merit badge for animal tracking. And I believe artofmanliness.com also had an article on animal tracking. So I've thought about this quite a bit previous to this description. I have some mental models for this. I have some reference points. Growing up, my friend's father was quite the hunter, and he was able to know where deer were with some kind of very keen instinct. We'd be driving in his car, for example, he'd be driving, and on a few occasions, he would say, up here on the right in a field, there are going to be deer. And we drive along, can't see him yet. We would drive along, and what do you know? Look to our right, I can picture this. It's a small, windy country road, not too small, you know. A town road, and there are fields with wooded barriers. So think a little bit foggy, and out in that field, 20, 30 deer grazing. And he's done this on a few occasions, and he was never wrong. So he had cultivated this ability to identify with the animal, to understand their habits, behaviors, their environment well enough to predict their behavior and location. And there's a part of his description of tracking that corresponds with that. I wrote down animal tracking, take on the perspective of the animal. Imagine the experience of the animal, become it, embody it to the extent possible. And he describes trying to track Socrates in this way, to become as much like Socrates as to understand him in that deeper, imaginative, animated, embodied way. Socrates was a soldier. I am engaged in a few practices to strengthen myself. Socrates was known to be physically vigorous, strenuous, to walk around with no shoes on, even in winter. I don't know how cold it gets in Athens in winter, but I shoveled my whole driveway of snow in just shorts and a t-shirt yesterday. There will be encouragement throughout this lecture series to do things that connect our mind and body, to strengthen and build that relationship. The meditative practice should come out into our life, and our life into the meditative practice. It's less so a special time set aside. I mean, it is that, right? We're exercising our capacity for present moment awareness, but so that we're strong enough to return to that present moment, to hold with us that reference experience, that we can return to the meditative state. At our choosing, we can choose an alternative path to stress, worry, anxiety, rumination, what have you, anger. He goes on to say, we would like to become deeply interwoven with Socrates, aspire to a life where you aspire to wisdom. Right, he emphasizes there's no method, right? Socrates didn't write a workbook. He didn't write at all. We know his works through what Plato has written. Plato and Socrates are essentially inextricably linked. in that way. And I like how he talks about, this is the complete works of Plato, so this is essentially everything that has been written about Socrates in Socrates' time. It's a big book. We know quite a bit about who he is and what he thought and the dialogues that Plato reports that he has had. Maybe there are other writings on Socrates as well. I'm not saying there aren't, but because of the way that he spoke and he had dialogue on so many different ideas, we are able to then ourselves put him into conversation with other thinkers, right? It's this idea of the great conversation, these dialogues of the most intelligent writers and thinkers, and the way that they've had a conversation with each other across the wisdom, in the wisdom tradition across time, the intellectual tradition of the Western world. So he endeavors to put Socrates into deep dialogue with Taoism, Christianity, Buddhism, Cynicism, Stoicism, Neoplatonism, and he describes a way, that there's a way to follow Socrates. It's a way of being. And Vervecchi gives us practices to engage with. And that's what I'm here to do. This companion series is intended to be a way for me to do the practices, to share the practices with you, and hopefully contribute some value in providing something for folks to follow along with as I do it myself and get valuable feedback. So I am just about done with episode 1, but there are a few more things that I would like to do before moving on to episode 2. At this point, I think that if you are listening and you'd like to follow along, you should commit at this point, make a decision to buy the books, to get your hands on the reading, which is a study part of the practice. So the 3 practices are dialogical reflection. We've already engaged in some of that. Imaginal engagement, and study. So I'll talk about study first. It looks like there's a few readings from Plato that we will be going over. Not all of them. So we've started already with the allegory of the cave. That's what I'm doing first. And then comes Plato's Apology. I'm quite familiar with the Apology, or the Apology of Socrates, right? Then Credo, Phaedo, Phaedrus, Symposium, and the Republic. Allegory of the Cave is an excerpt from the Republic. It starts at book 7 of the Republic. I've got a few questions here. Why dialogues? I think that there's a few. Marcus Aurelius, the gentleman behind me here, in his meditations, he goes through and he thanks people who have been influential in his formative years for the lessons that they've learned or taught him, that he learned from them. And among those is he's thanking someone who instructed him to write dialogues as a student. So I think dialogues are a very important instructive tool to read them, to write them. Often the natural flow of verbal communication has qualities to it that make it quite natural to listen to and feel like we can participate in. I personally, maybe it is known, but I personally don't really know a lot about what the intent was. Was Plato really there? Did he send his students around and then sort of collect? They all took notes, and then he kind of collected a record from whoever was recording. Another question is, why is Plato seemingly absent? I have a few answers to that. Maybe he's busy writing. Maybe he's there in the moment, and he's just taking notes, and that's what he thinks he could benefit most from the experience, and that was his choice rather than participating in the discussion. Socrates was doing his thing, perhaps, and it was sufficiently good conversation. Maybe he didn't think he was much of a conversationalist himself, or maybe he took it upon himself to record these conversations for posterity, which he thought was more valuable, and maybe he figured he can participate in the discussion afterwards by taking what was said and amending it, altering it, or tweaking it, or enhancing it, and with some editorial discretion rather than speak as a participant in the discussion. Cicero, interestingly enough, wrote many of his works as a conversation between several characters. Cicero wrote, for example, on how to be a true friend. And he did this by writing a fictional story about a conversation where the person who is his teacher was having a conversation and was asked to talk about friendship. His teacher was good friends with someone, and some young men approached him and talked him into going on and telling them everything he knew about how to be a good friend. When in reality, it's pretty well known that Cicero was writing it about himself and his best friend. But he used these other characters of men who were tangential to his own life but deceased to write a dialogue in order to articulate these ideas. It makes sense. Another thing you can do when writing a dialogue that's fictional is you're naturally thinking through the natural path of both sides of the argument. Imagine writing a debate. You're both attacking a position, defending a position. You're arguing both sides. The question is, how can I put it into practice? And that's what we're going to endeavor to find out, isn't it? And he says something, one thing that is just like, huh? He talks about a reciprocal reinterpretation between Socrates and Eros, Socrates and the erotic. Socrates and the erotic? Okay, John, Whatever you say. And then there are 2 books, which are quote books that he recommends buying. I found them for, one was $5, one was $10 on Amazon. I've purchased them. Now would be a good time for you to make a choice on whether or not you're going to purchase texts in order to follow along and commit to this path. I think I am pretty content with that for today. Oh, wait. Want to hear some more of Allegory the Cave, don't you? So, as we go through this, some people like to listen to things read. Some people prefer to read them themselves. I would recommend reading. That's what I prefer. But I'm just reading this out loud. If you want to navigate away from the video at this point and read it on your own, you won't offend me in the slightest. Whatever works best for you. Listening works. That's fine. So I left off Plato's Republic, Book 7, in this Complete Works of Plato, Hackett Publishers, edited by John M. Cooper. I am on page 135, towards the bottom. So we imagined ourselves as the prisoners in the cave. We imagined ourselves emerging from the cave, seeing things in daylight as they truly are for the first time, returning to the cave, trying to persuade the others to come see what you have seen. Imagined ourselves in that frustration as they might reject or deny your experience, or as ourselves, as the other prisoners, having this escapee trying to get us out into the sunlight. No, it isn't. But anyone with an understanding would remember that the eyes may be confused in 2 ways, and from 2 causes, namely, when they've come from the light into the darkness, and when they've come from the darkness into the light. Realizing that the same applies to the soul. When someone sees a soul disturbed and unable to see something, he won't laugh mindlessly, but he'll take into consideration whether it has come from a brighter life and is dimmed through not having yet become accustomed to the dark, or whether it has come from greater ignorance into greater light and is dazzled by the increased brilliance. Then he'll declare the first soul happy in its experience in life, and he'll pity the latter. But even if he chooses to make fun of it, at least he'd be less ridiculous than if he laughed at a soul that has come from the light above. What you say is very reasonable. If that is true, then here's what we must think about these matters. Education isn't what some people declare it to be, namely putting knowledge into souls that lack it, but like putting sight into blind eyes. They do say that. But our present discussion, on the other hand, shows that the power to learn is present in everyone's soul, and the instrument with which each learns is like an eye that cannot be turned around from darkness to light without turning the whole body. This instrument cannot be turned around from that which is coming into being without turning the whole soul until it is able to study that which is the brightest thing that is, namely, the one we call the good. Isn't that right? Yes. Then education is the craft concerned with doing this very thing, this turning around, and with how the soul can most easily and effectively be made to do it. It isn't the craft of putting sight into the soul. Education takes for granted that sight is there, but it isn't turned the right way or looking where it ought to look and tries to redirect it appropriately. So it seems. Now it looks as though the other so-called virtues of the soul are akin to those of the body, for they really aren't there beforehand but are added later by habit and practice. However, the virtue of reason seems to belong, above all, to something more divine, which never loses its power, but is either useful or beneficial or useless and harmful, depending on the way it is turned. Or have you never noticed this about people who are said to be vicious but clever? How keen the vision of their souls is, and how sharply it distinguishes the things it is turned towards. This shows that its sight isn't inferior, but rather is forced to serve evil ends, so that the sharper it sees, the more evil it accomplishes. Absolutely. However, if a nature of this sort had been hammered at from childhood, and freed from the bonds of kinship with becoming, which would have fastened to it by feasting, greed, and other such pleasures, and which, like leaden weights, pull its vision downwards. If, being rid of these, it turned to look at true things, then I say that the same soul of the same person would see these most sharply, just as it now does the things it presently turned towards. Probably so. And what about the uneducated who have no experience of truth? Isn't it likely, indeed, doesn't it follow necessarily from what was said before, that they will never adequately govern a city? But neither would those who have been allowed to spend their whole lives being educated. The former will fail because they don't have a single goal at which all their actions, public and private, inevitably aim. The latter will fail because they refuse to act, thinking that they had settled while still alive in the faraway isles of the blessed. That's true. It is our task as founders, then, to compel the best natures to reach the study we said before is the most important, namely, to make the ascent and see the good. But when they've made it and look sufficiently, we mustn't allow them to do what they're allowed to do today. What is that? To stay there and refuse to go down again to the prisoners in the cave and share their labors and honors, whether they are less worth or of greater. Then are we to do them an injustice by making them live a worse life when they could be living a better one? You're forgetting again that it isn't the law's concern to make any one class in the city outstandingly happy, but to contrive to spread happiness throughout the city by bringing the citizens into harmony with each other through persuasion or compulsion, and by making them share with each other the benefits that each class can confer on the community. The law provides such people in the city, not in order to allow them to turn in whatever direction they want, but to make use of them to bind the city together. That's true, I had forgotten. Observe then, Glaucon, that we won't be doing an injustice to those who've become philosophers in our city, and what we'll say to them when we compel them to guard and care for others will be just. We'll say, when people like you come to be in other cities, they're justified in not sharing in their city's labors, for they've grown there spontaneously, against the will of the Constitution. And what grows of its own accord and owes no debt for its upbringing has justice on its side when it isn't keen to pay anyone for that upbringing. But we've made you kings in our city and leaders of the swarm, as it were, both for yourselves and for the rest of the city. You're better and more completely educated than the others, and are better able to share in both types of life. Therefore, each of you in turn must go down to live in the common dwelling place of the others, and grow accustomed to seeing in the dark. When you are used to it, you'll see vastly better than the people there. And because you've seen the truth about fine, just, and good things, you'll know each image for what it is, and also that of which it is the image. Thus for you and for us, the city will be governed not like the majority of cities nowadays, by people who fight over shadows and struggle against one another in order to rule, as if that were a great good, but by people who are awake rather than dreaming. For the truth is surely this: a cities whose prospective rulers are at least eager to rule must of necessity be the most free from civil war, whereas a city with the opposite kind of rulers is governed the opposite way. Absolutely. So he uses this allegory. The prisoners in the cave haven't seen good or truth or things as they really are. They're not oriented towards those things. One of the prisoners escapes, sees the world for what it truly is, comes back, experiences something that we've all experienced, wanting to evangelize this good, true thing that they've seen, to share it with other people. He's sort of theoretically met with resistance. That's not necessarily the case. He could be persuasive. And returns to the cave, and all of this is for Socrates to make the point that in the ideal city-state that he is presenting in the Republic, that there's sort of an elite class of philosophers, but they must not be separated off in their own place, but live in common dwellings and be amongst the people and do the most they can to share those higher forms that they've witnessed with these people who are in the shadows. You know, it's not really my favorite. You know, it falls short in a lot of ways of the intellectual nuance of how one comes to hold and understand knowledge and I think it serves to illustrate in a general sense a pretty universal experience of learning something, seeing and understanding something and wanting to share that thing with people who don't see it. Sometimes they reject it. All right. I think we can stop there for today. Thank you for being here and joining me. Please smash the like button, leave any thoughts you have in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe if you're not already. I would appreciate it. See you next time.